What does it mean for a human being to go so far from Earth that our whole world stops feeling like a place and starts looking like a fragile idea? What does it mean for a man to sit inside a spacecraft surrounded by metal, fire, procedure, silence, memory, history, and the expectations of millions, and know that if everything works, he will travel beyond the invisible line that has contained almost every human spaceflight in history? And what does it mean that this man is Victor Glover, a naval aviator, a test pilot, a father, an astronaut, and a symbol not because he asked to become one, but because history placed weight on his shoulders and he kept walking anyway? Stay with me, because this is not just a story about the moon, and it is not just a story about rockets. It is a story about distance, pressure, patience, representation, excellence, and the terrifying beauty of being close enough to the moon to stop seeing it as a picture in the sky and start seeing it as a real world. And before we go deeper, press like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because stories like this only become complete when we remember that while a few human beings leave Earth, all of humanity watches with them. There is something almost cruel about the phrase low Earth orbit, because it sounds modest, technical, maybe even routine. Yet for more than half a century, it has been the boundary that has quietly defined modern human spaceflight. Most astronauts who have ever flown have remained there, circling close to home, still deep inside Earth's gravitational influence, still protected in ways we rarely think about, still one orbital neighborhood away from rescue plans, communications networks, and the psychological comfort of proximity. Low Earth orbit is astonishing, but it is also familiar now. It is a frontier that, with enough training and enough engineering, humanity has learned to revisit. Leaving it is something else entirely. Leaving it means stepping away not just from Earth, but from the whole operational logic that has governed most crewed spaceflights since the Apollo era ended. It means entering cislunar space, deep space, a region where mistakes become more expensive, communication becomes more psychologically thin, radiation becomes more serious, rescue becomes more abstract. And every glance out the window carries the ancient feeling that you are somewhere human beings were not meant to be, yet have always dreamed of going. That is why the title of this story feels larger than biography. Victor Glover is not merely attached to a mission, he is attached to a threshold. And thresholds are strange things. They do not look dramatic when you stand on one. There is no music, no cosmic voice announces that history has been divided into before and after. Usually there is just a hatch, a checklist, a schedule, a seat, a launch vehicle, and a human being who spent years preparing so thoroughly that when the moment finally arrives, the action looks almost calm. Yet that calmness is deceptive. Behind it are generations, behind it are institutions that change too slowly, behind it are doors that stayed closed too long. Behind it are children who looked up at the sky and saw wonder but did not always see themselves. So when we talk about Victor Glover in the context of deep space flight and the moon, we are not decorating a mission with symbolism after the fact. We are recognizing that the mission already contains symbolism in its structure, whether anyone speaks of it or not. To understand why this matters, you have to resist the temptation to flatten Victor Glover into a headline. Headlines like firsts, because firsts are easy to remember, but a first is never truly a beginning. It is the visible edge of a long, invisible build. It is the moment when years of study, discipline, selection, training, service, historical delay, institutional change, and individual resilience finally become visible enough for the public to notice. Long before any rocket can rise, a life has to be shaped. Victor Glover did not emerge from nowhere as a historical symbol. He emerged from classrooms, from family influence, from competition, from effort, from aviation, from mathematics, from military culture, from the stubborn accumulation of competence that marks almost every astronaut's life. When people talk casually about astronauts, they often sound as if NASA simply chooses the smartest people in the room, but that is not enough. Astronauts are chosen from the overlap between brilliance and steadiness, talent and humility, technical mastery and social reliability, courage and obedience to process. The space program does not merely need heroes, it needs humans who can operate inside systems where ego is more dangerous than vacuum. Victor Glover's path through the Navy matters for this reason. Military aviation is not just about flying fast aircraft. It is an education in controlled risk. It is an environment where attention is survival, where procedures are not suggestions, where the machine punishes fantasy and rewards discipline. Carrier operations, instrument flying, formation work, systems awareness, emergency response, crew coordination, and mission execution all shape a certain mental architecture. A pilot trained in that world learns that courage is not loud. Courage is methodical. Courage is what remains after the adrenaline burns away, and only precision matters. Test pilots and highly trained aviators are often described as cool under pressure, but that phrase is almost too simple. The deeper truth is that they build a relationship with danger that is neither denial nor romance. They do not worship risk. They do not run from it. They study it, compartmentalize it, train against it, and then work inside it. That mindset translates powerfully into astronautics, because spacecraft are unforgiving. Space is indifferent, and the human body, for all its intelligence and beauty, is astonishingly fragile when separated from the planet that made it. When NASA selected Victor Glover as an astronaut, the decision reflected more than a resume. It reflected a pattern of trust. The astronaut office is one of the few places on Earth where excellence is still measured by whether others would trust you with their life inside a metal vessel, moving through a lethal environment at extraordinary speed. You can feel the seriousness of that standard. An astronaut can be brilliant and still not fit the role. An astronaut can be strong and still not fit the role. What NASA needs are people who can think clearly while sleep-deprived, communicate while under strain, learn constantly, follow orders, give orders when necessary, absorb criticism, remain teachable, improvise within limits, and carry the pressure of being observed by the world without becoming psychologically distorted by that observation. Victor Glover belonged in that rare category, and his earlier spaceflight experience only deepened that trust. His mission to the International Space Station was not a side note. It was part of the making of a deep space crew member. Low Earth orbit, even if it is not the same as lunar distance, teaches lessons that no simulator can fully reproduce. It teaches what it means to live in microgravity for real, not for a training block. It teaches how the body drifts, how ordinary tasks become strange, how motion and stillness trade places, how sleep changes, how tools behave, how surfaces become directions, and how the mind gradually adjusts to a place where up and down are emotional habits rather than physical truths. It also teaches the human side of spaceflight. You learn what silence feels like when Earth is outside the window. You learn how cooperation stops being a virtue and becomes oxygen for the social system of the crew. You learn how quickly irritation can become dangerous if you do not master yourself. You learn that every conversation, every procedure, every maintenance action, every handhold, every label, every sound in the cabin can matter. When Victor Glover flew to the International Space Station, he was not merely adding flight hours. He was undergoing the transformation all spacefarers undergo, the first time Earth becomes the outside rather than the ground. An Earth from orbit changes people in a way that is difficult to describe without sounding poetic, which is unfortunate, because it is also operationally real. Astronauts speak about seeing the thin blue line of the atmosphere, the sharp blackness beyond it, the lack of borders, the beauty of storms, the curve of the planet, the brilliance of sunrise, the speed of orbital sunset, and the emotional disorientation of realizing that home looks small enough to fit inside a single glance. For many, this becomes part of what is often called the overview effect, a shift in perception that is not mystical in the cheap sense but profound in the literal one. When you see Earth from outside, you begin to understand how much of human conflict rests on illusions of permanence and separation. Yet even that view from low Earth orbit is still close. Earth is still dominant. Earth still fills the window. Earth still feels immediate. The Moon, from there, remains a destination. Deep space is where the psychological geometry changes. Deep space is where Earth begins to become object rather than environment. That is why the journey from low Earth orbit to lunar distance is not just an engineering escalation, it is a philosophical escalation. In low Earth orbit, you are away from Earth. On a lunar mission, you are between worlds, that between matters. It is one of the loneliest and most revealing positions human beings can occupy. You're not on Earth, but you're not yet at the Moon. You're held inside a trajectory, a corridor of energy and timing carved through celestial mechanics. You're sustained by life support systems so intricate that one broken component can become a chain of concern. You're surrounded by deep black that does not care who you are, what flag is on the vehicle, or how historic the crew may be. That indifference is part of what makes the human achievement beautiful. Space does not celebrate us. We bring meaning with us. If you want to understand why Victor Glover's name carries such force in this context, you have to place him against the history of American spaceflight. The early astronaut corps emerged from a very specific culture: military test pilots, overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly male, drawn from systems that mirrored the exclusions of the nation itself. This was not accidental. It reflected who had access to certain educational institutions, who could enter elite flight pipelines, who was permitted into professional roles that later became astronaut pathways, and whose excellence institutions had been conditioned to recognize. The result was a paradox that should still unsettle us. The United States developed the technological capacity to put men on the moon before it developed the social capacity to distribute opportunity equally across the full range of its own talent. The rocket advanced faster than representation. The guidance computer advanced faster than justice. The hardware moved at one speed, the culture at another. That is why a milestone like Victor Glover's potential role beyond low Earth orbit is not merely symbolic decoration placed around a technical program. It reveals the lag between who could go and who should have been able to go. Some people become impatient when representation is discussed in scientific or exploratory contexts, as if history should be stripped down to machinery alone. But that impatience misunderstands what exploration really is. Exploration is never just about reaching a place. It is about who is allowed to embody that reaching. When a human being steps into a frontier, they do not arrive there empty. They bring language, ancestry, institutions, memory, identity, and the interpretive power of visibility. A child watching a launch does not merely absorb thrust curves and mission profiles. They absorb possibility. And possibility has always been distributed unequally. Victor Glover's significance, then, is not that he becomes important because of race, nor that his technical accomplishments somehow require social meaning to justify them. It is that his technical accomplishments and his historical significance exist together without contradiction. He is not symbolic instead of competent. He is symbolic because he is competent at a level so high that history can no longer pretend certain doors remained closed only because the right people had not arrived. His presence makes that excuse impossible. He demonstrates, in public, at the frontier, under the harsh light of elite performance. What should have been obvious all along: excellence was never the missing ingredient. Access was. Then there is the moon itself. And here the story becomes emotionally dangerous because the moon is so familiar from Earth that people forget how alien it really is. On Earth, the moon is romance, ritual, calendar, tide, metaphor, a circle in children's drawings, a lantern in poems, a witness in myths. It is close enough to live in culture, but up close, the moon becomes geological, severe, silent, violent in its history, stripped of atmosphere, painted in crater shadows blacker than instinct expects, flooded in sunlight harsher than landscape photography can honestly convey. Up close, the moon is not gentle. It does not glow for us. It reflects. It waits. It carries the scars of impacts accumulated over immense stretches of time, and because there is no weather to erase them, the past remains visible with unnerving clarity. To see the moon up close with human eyes is to witness time exposed on a world that has no air to soften it. Imagine that for a moment. Imagine training for years, launching atop a rocket powerful enough to hurl a crude spacecraft beyond the routine pathways of orbit, riding through vibrations so intense that conversation becomes effort, then reaching the calm after ascent, the strange quiet where machinery hums and bodies begin adapting, and at some point the trajectory carries you farther than most astronauts have ever gone. Earth begins to reduce, the moon begins to enlarge. The ancient object that guided farmers, lovers, sailors, poets, and religious calendars is no longer a distant disk. It becomes terrain. Craters stop being spots and become structures. Light stops washing over it and begins to reveal harsh relief. Its far side, the hidden hemisphere that no human standing on Earth can ever directly see, becomes not a diagram in a textbook but a presence beyond the window. That experience is more than visual. It is civilizational. It compresses myth and measurement into a single human moment. And if that moment belongs to Victor Glover, or is even approached through his place in the Artemis story, then the historical resonance becomes almost overwhelming. Because it is not only that a human being sees the moon up close, it is that a line long drawn around who gets remembered in exploration history begins to widen in plain view. Think about how many firsts in American history were delayed not by lack of ability, but by the stubborn inertia of systems. Think about how often extraordinary black excellence in science, engineering, aviation, military service, and mathematics had to exist at a level beyond ordinary excellence simply to receive ordinary recognition. Think about how much patience that requires, how much repeated proof, how much composure in environments that may celebrate your achievement while still barely understanding the full cost of your arrival. Then imagine carrying that inheritance into deep space. This is where the phrase "first black astronaut to leave low Earth orbit" becomes heavy. Being first is never a simple honor. It is pressure disguised as celebration. It is visibility without privacy. It is admiration mixed with projection. It is the burden of knowing that some people will overstate your symbolism and ignore your skill, while others will acknowledge your skill but resent the symbolism. It is walking a narrow human path between those distortions. You're expected to be historically meaningful, but also flawlessly professional, emotionally accessible but not distracted, inspiring but not theatrical, representative but never reduced. To be first is to be looked at too much and understood too little, and yet firsts matter because someone has to cross the line. Someone has to turn the abstract argument into a human fact. What makes Victor Glover so compelling in this story is that he does not appear crafted for spectacle. He appears shaped by substance. There is a kind of public figure who seeks importance by performing importance, and there is another kind whose seriousness comes from the quiet depth of preparation. Astronauts, at their best, belong to the second kind. They know that spaceflight punishes drama. The work is too technical, too interdependent, too contingent on procedure. Even heroism in space often looks mundane to the untrained eye. A switch thrown at the correct time, a checklist followed, a system anomaly noticed early, a crewmate supported in an unglamorous moment, a calm voice during a nominally minor but psychologically significant deviation. The public likes launch and splashdown because they are visible drama, but missions are really built out of disciplined attention. That is where trust is earned. The spacecraft that would carry humans beyond low Earth orbit in the Artemis era, Orion, embodies this discipline in hardware form. Orion is not a capsule designed merely to skim the edge of possibility. It is a deep space vehicle, built for distances and durations beyond the daily rhythms of station operations. Its systems are not interesting because they are futuristic in a cinematic sense. They are interesting because they are nested acts of survival. Environmental control systems keep the cabin inhabitable. Power systems must remain stable and resilient. Guidance, navigation, and control systems must know exactly where the spacecraft is, where it is going, and how to correct itself when the unforgiving mathematics of trajectory demand precision. Thermal protection matters not only during ascent or quiet cruise, but especially on return, when the spacecraft must survive re-entry at energies far beyond those associated with low Earth orbit missions. Everything about Orion reflects a blunt truth. Deep space travel is not just farther, it is harsher. And then there is the launch vehicle, the giant source of violence beneath the apparent elegance of exploration. Every serene shot of a moonbound spacecraft floating gracefully against blackness hides the fact that the mission began with controlled fury. To escape Earth's gravitational hold enough to set a crew on a translunar path requires immense energy. There is something almost mythic about a rocket powerful enough to convert chemical potential into an arc that lifts human beings toward another world. But there is nothing magical about it. It is engineering at the edge of structural limits, combustion constrained with intolerances, hardware enduring forces that would destroy almost anything built carelessly. The crew sits atop this violence strapped into a narrow margin between success and catastrophe, and what allows them to do so is not recklessness, but the cumulative weight of testing, analysis, redundancy, simulation, and institutional memory etched in triumph and tragedy alike. Spaceflight has always had this double face. On one side, wonder, on the other, hazard. The closer a mission comes to deep space, the more openly those hazards reveal themselves. Radiation is not a cinematic beam cutting across the cabin. It is an invisible accumulation of risk. Beyond the shielding effects associated with lower orbits, crews face a more serious radiation environment, especially from solar particle events and the broader background of deep space. Micrometeoroids do not announce themselves. They move at extraordinary speeds. Thermal regulation in space is its own paradox because vacuum does not transfer heat the way air does. And so vehicles have to manage energy carefully under conditions of sunlight and shadow that can push systems toward dangerous extremes. Life support cannot simply fail gracefully. It must remain functional under all the small insults and contingencies a mission may encounter. Deep space crews operate under the knowledge that help is not just far away in distance, it is far away in time. That temporal distance matters psychologically. In low Earth orbit, there is a sense, however abstract, that Earth remains close, infrastructure remains nearby. Mission control is almost leaning over your shoulder. In cislunar space, the emotional geometry stretches. Signals take longer. Plans must be more autonomous. The crew must become more self-contained, not merely as operators but as a social unit. In such an environment, the quality of the human relationships inside the spacecraft matters with almost biological seriousness. This is why crew selection is never just about individual brilliance. It is about compatibility, trust, communication style, and the ability to remain both honest and composed in confined environments, where tension cannot be escaped by walking outside. Victor Glover's long training, prior experience, and reputation for steady professionalism become essential here, because a lunar crew is not a collection of stars. It is an organism. There is also the matter of perspective, and perspective may be the least measurable yet most enduring result of a journey beyond low Earth orbit. We tend to think of exploration in terms of data, images, milestones, budgets, hardware, and mission outcomes, all of which are real and necessary. But human spaceflight has always carried another kind of payload: perception. The people who go out return with altered ways of seeing the planet, the mission, and themselves. The farther they go, the stronger this perceptual shift can become. To see Earth from lunar distance is not just to see a smaller globe. It is to see the entire human story compressed into a bright sphere hanging in darkness. Every city, every language, every war, every prayer, every library, every celebration, every injustice, every promise. Every child asleep, every hospital night shift, every classroom exam, every whispered apology, every act of courage, every betrayal, every wedding, every mourning, every invention, every revolution, every song, every unfinished dream exists there. And from deep space, it all fits into something you can partially cover with a thumb. That image should disturb us a little, because it reveals how much of human arrogance depends on not seeing ourselves from enough distance. It also reveals something else: why representation in space matters so deeply. If Earth appears borderless from beyond orbit, then the humans who carry Earth outward should increasingly reflect the diversity already present on that world. Exploration cannot remain mature while its imagery remains narrow. A civilization that wants to call itself planetary must eventually allow the face of planetary aspiration to become genuinely plural. Victor Glover's role in this story matters because it expands that imagery at a location where imagery becomes destiny. The farther out you go, the more symbolic the traveller becomes, whether they like it or not. At the edge of familiar human space, you're no longer just representing yourself. You're representing the current moral and institutional state of the civilization that sent you. This is one reason the Artemis era feels different from Apollo, even though both are linked by the moon. Apollo was driven by urgency, rivalry, and the stunning pressure of proving technological supremacy in the Cold War. It was one of the great feats in the history of engineering and organized will, but it emerged from a specific historical tension and reflected the limits of its era. Artemis inherits the technical daring of lunar flight, but it carries a different public promise. It speaks not only of return but of sustainability, international partnership, broader representation, and the idea that the moon is not merely a place to touch once for geopolitical effect, but a gateway for longer-term human operations beyond Earth. That shift changes the emotional meaning of the mission. Apollo asked whether humanity could reach the moon. Artemis asks what kind of humanity is returning. In that sense, Victor Glover becomes part of a larger answer. He stands at the intersection of continuity and correction. Continuity because lunar exploration still demands the same fundamental virtues it always did: intelligence, courage, discipline, teamwork, engineering, and acceptance of risk. correction, because the visible human image of that exploration is finally becoming wider. It is not a rejection of the past, it is an expansion of it, and that expansion is not cosmetic. It affects how future generations understand their relationship to science, aviation, engineering, the military, public service, and the cosmos itself. When a young black student sees Victor Glover associated with deep space exploration, they are not watching a generic success story. They are watching the frontier revise its own memory in real time. But let us return to the individual human being, because history can become abstract if we are not careful. Imagine the private side of such a role. Imagine knowing that your name will be attached to a first, and yet your daily life is full of ordinary obligations. Family, fatigue, schedules, training sessions, medical checks, simulations, reviews, travel, repetition, public appearances, technical study, and the endless need to stay sharp. Imagine the discipline required to keep the historical dimension from swelling into vanity or anxiety. Astronauts do not have the luxury of being consumed by their own legend. If they start believing too much in the story the public tells about them, they become less safe. The mission needs you humble, not mythologized. It needs you precise, not self-dramatized. So there is a quiet nobility in the way real astronauts carry extraordinary narratives inside ordinary professional behavior. They let the story exist without performing it. The moon, of course, does not care about any of this. It has no opinion about firsts, representation, or the stories Earth tells itself. That indifference can sound cold, but it is part of what gives the achievement its purity. Human beings create meaning under conditions that do not provide it for free. The moon is rock, dust, crater, slope, ejector, shadow, sunlight, scar. It is also memory, destination, mirror, witness, and challenge. It has pulled at human imagination for longer than civilization has kept written records. Yet seeing it up close rearranges all those meanings. The object of myth becomes measurable landscape. The soft face in the night becomes a brutal world, and the astronaut who approaches it does not simply confirm science. He experiences a collision between ancient imagination and immediate reality. Think about Victor Glover looking through a window as the moon grows larger. Think about what must happen inside the mind at that moment. He would know the equations, the timelines, the systems. He would know the training flow, the mission sequence, the contingency logic. He would know how many teams on Earth made the moment possible. He would know that he was not drifting there by inspiration alone, but by engines, software, metallurgy, years of policy, budget battles, and the labor of thousands. Yet there is still no training scenario that can fully absorb the human shock of nearness. There is no simulator that can reproduce the exact emotional frequency of seeing the moon not as an idea above you, but as a world beside you. This is why even the most technical missions contain something irreducibly spiritual, not in the doctrinal sense, but in the sense of awakening. Space confronts the human mind with scales it did not evolve to manage, and when the mind manages them anyway, it changes. What does such a change produce? For some, it produces gratitude. For some, humility. For some, a sharpened sense of responsibility. For some, a grief they did not expect, because beauty at that scale can make Earth's violence feel more absurd. For others, it produces determination to continue the work, to open the door wider, to turn a rare experience into a more common human inheritance. This may be one of the most important aspects of Victor Glover's significance. His journey is not meaningful only if it remains unique. It is meaningful because it helps normalize the idea that deep space, though still extraordinarily difficult, is a place where a wide range of humanity can be seen. The first matters not so that it stays the only. The first matters so that the second becomes thinkable, and the third becomes expected, and eventually the extraordinary becomes part of civilization's expanded self-image. Yet we should resist the temptation to romanticize the process too quickly. Deep space exploration remains brutally hard. Hardware slips, launch dates move, engineers discover issues, components are re-examined, programs absorb political winds, budget changes, manufacturing realities, test results, and the relentless complexity of integrating systems that cannot be allowed to fail in ways ordinary technologies routinely do. Human beings love to narrate spaceflight as if history moves in a clean line. It does not. It moves in pauses, delays, redesigns, arguments, near misses, cautious approvals, and painful memory. Every successful mission is built over the graves of bad assumptions. The public often sees the polished surface. The insiders live with the friction underneath. That is why any astronaut associated with a lunar mission must cultivate patience as much as courage. The rocket does not care about your symbolic timetable. The moon will wait. The challenge is to wait without losing momentum. This makes Victor Glover's story even more compelling, because it is not the story of a man chasing applause. It is the story of a professional shaped for long effort. Military life, advanced technical education, test culture, astronaut training, and operational flying all build a relationship with time that differs from the public's appetite for instant climax. You learn to accept that the visible moment depends on countless invisible hours. You learn that history often looks sudden from a distance but feels incremental from inside. You learn to prepare for events that may move, versus to sustain focus without constant reward, and to remain ready because readiness itself is the profession. This quiet relationship with delayed significance may be one of the deepest forms of discipline. It is easy to stay committed when the spotlight is immediate. It is harder when the horizon moves and you must keep walking anyway. There is another layer here, one that touches family and the private cost of public missions. Astronauts do not travel alone. Even when only a few bodies sit inside the spacecraft, their families carry invisible parts of the mission: absence, uncertainty, interrupted routines, emotional strain, and the knowledge that the work they are supporting is noble and dangerous at the same time. This becomes even more intense when the mission is historic, because the public sees inspiration while the family also sees risk. To be proud of someone and afraid for them at the same time is one of the deepest emotional contradictions human life allows. Space exploration asks families to live inside that contradiction with grace. Victor Glover's role in this story is therefore not only individual, it is relational. Behind the astronaut is a network of love that has learned how to coexist with danger. When we say that someone leaves low Earth orbit, it is worth pausing on the literalness of the phrase. Orbit is not just a path, it is a kind of captivity. A beautiful captivity, but captivity nonetheless. To orbit Earth is to be in perpetual falling around the planet rather than free from its hold. To leave low Earth orbit on a lunar trajectory is to change that relationship. It is to stop circling home and start departing from it. That departure does something ancient to the human imagination. For millennia, the moon was the nearest unreachable world, close enough to shape our nights, far enough to humble our tools. When humans first reached it in the Apollo era, they proved that unreachable was a temporary category. But when the last Apollo crew came home, a strange thing happened. Humanity retained the achievement without retaining its continuity. The road remained technically real but culturally thin. Deep space flight became memory rather than habit. Artemis seeks to change that, and Victor Glover's place within that effort therefore matters beyond the individual mission profile. A civilization changes not only through invention but through repetition. When something once impossible becomes repeatable, the structure of imagination changes. Air travel transformed the world not because the Wright brothers flew once, but because flight became a system. Satellite communications transformed Earth not because one payload reached orbit, but because space became infrastructure. In the same way, deep space human travel will only become civilizationally mature when it stops being an isolated miracle and begins becoming a sustained capability. Lunar missions in the modern era are part of that shift. Each crew carries not only scientific and technical objectives, but also the burden of normalizing the road outward. Victor Glover's presence on that road expands who that normalization includes. And think about the children. History is often discussed by adults as if it belongs to institutions, but children are the ones who absorb its imagery most directly. A child may not understand propulsion architecture, radiation shielding, spacecraft avionics, life support redundancy, or translunar injection burns, but they understand faces, they understand names, they understand who looks like they belong in a place. The effect of that understanding can be delayed by years. A child sees someone like Victor Glover associated with the moon and deep space, and perhaps nothing visible happens immediately. Then a decade later, that same child chooses calculus instead of quitting, chooses engineering instead of shrinking, chooses aviation instead of self-doubt, chooses public service instead of cynicism, chooses the hard road because someone else made it visible that the hard road does not belong to one kind of person. That is how representation works at its deepest level. It changes the internal negotiation between ambition and permission. Critics sometimes dismiss this as sentiment. They are wrong. It is infrastructure of the mind. Nations spend fortunes building launch pads, research laboratories, training centers, factories, communication networks, and spacecraft. All of that matters. But the pipeline of future explorers also depends on a more fragile structure. Belief. Not vague motivational belief, but specific belonging. Do I belong in physics? Do I belong in engineering? Do I belong in elite military aviation? Do I belong in a room where astronauts are selected? Do I belong in the story of humanity moving outward? When those questions are answered by visible evidence rather than slogans, belief becomes more durable. Victor Glover's presence at the edge of deep space history operates in precisely that territory. Now imagine the mission itself in sensory terms. The launch is thunder and compression, but the hours after launch are a transition into a different genre of experience. Restraints loosen, the body begins to float. Small objects reveal the truth of weightlessness by drifting where instinct expects them to fall. Voices from mission control blend with onboard routines. The crew moves through procedures with practiced economy. The Earth outside is still dominant, luminous, crowded with weather. But then the trajectory begins to announce itself through perspective. Home starts to move from immediate to observed. The moon is no longer a distant point in thought, but a converging destination in geometry. The cabin becomes a tiny protected island crossing a black ocean without wind or smell or horizon. And in that island, humans continue doing what humans always do when survival depends on order. They check, confirm, monitor, compare, report, adjust, and look out the window more often than protocol alone would justify, because no protocol can erase wonder. Wonder, however, cannot replace competence. This is a crucial part of the astronaut's mental life. The public often imagines a space mission as a continuous flow of awe. In reality, awe has to coexist with procedure. You may be witnessing one of the most extraordinary views in human experience, but you still need to verify system status, maintain schedules, preserve resources, communicate clearly, and manage fatigue. One of the most beautiful things about astronauts is not that they feel wonder, but that they can feel wonder without allowing it to degrade performance. They can encounter magnificence and still remain operational. In a way, this is the highest form of respect for the mission. You do not honor the view by abandoning discipline. You honor it by proving that human beings can behold the sublime and still function. This balance between awe and function is where Victor Glover's life seems especially suited to the role. The combination of military service, advanced education, test discipline, previous spaceflight, and public responsibility produces a human style that can hold both precision and meaning. He is not merely an observer sent to marvel at the moon. He is an operator entrusted with the system. Yet because he's also historically situated, every technical action he performs in deep space echoes culturally. This is part of what makes his journey so rich to interpret. The mission is real in the hard, unforgiving language of engineering, and it is real in the equally consequential language of public memory. Switch throws and symbolism coexist in the same cabin. When people say see the moon up close, they may imagine a romantic visual experience, but experts understand that proximity changes operational reality. The moon's gravity begins to matter more. Navigation solutions refine. The timing of maneuvers becomes increasingly mission-critical. Observation is not passive. The crew is participating in a dynamic choreography of celestial mechanics, propulsion, and systems management. The moon's far side, in particular, also carries a special weight in human imagination. It is not permanently dark, despite the phrase dark side that popular culture loves, but it is permanently hidden from direct human sight on Earth, because the moon is tidally locked. To approach that far side as a crew member is to move into a region that generations only knew through inference, maps, robotic missions, and images. Human eyes meeting that geography from nearby space would connect the age of myth to the age of presence. There is a deep irony here. Human beings spent thousands of years making stories about the moon because they could not go. Now we can go, and the story becomes even stranger, not less. The closer science comes to a world, the more emotionally complex that world often becomes. Knowledge does not kill wonder, it refines it. Knowing the moon's craters were formed by impacts, knowing the basalt plains are ancient lava flows, knowing the regolith is sharp and abrasive, knowing the absence of atmosphere produces certain lighting conditions, knowing the orbital mechanics of lunar travel. None of this makes the moon ordinary. It makes it more astonishing because now the wonder is tethered to reality. The moon is not enchanting because we are ignorant of it. It is enchanting because reality itself is grander than the fantasies we once used to approximate it. This is why an authentic script about Victor Glover and the moon has to live in both domains. It has to honor technical reality and emotional consequence at once. Too much sentiment and we drift into empty inspiration. Too much machinery, and we miss the human meaning that makes space exploration publicly alive. The real power lies in the fusion. A man shaped by discipline and service, trusted by one of the most demanding institutions on Earth, attached to a mission that reopens deep space human flight, standing at the possibility of being the first black astronaut to cross beyond low Earth orbit and see the moon up close. That is not just a fact pattern. It is a narrative node where engineering, history, culture, and human aspiration intersect with unusual clarity. There is also something profoundly democratic about the gaze from deep space. On Earth, power often distorts perspective. Up there, the absurdity of many earthly divisions becomes harder to ignore. This does not magically solve politics, nor erase injustice, nor grant astronauts prophetic purity. But it does present a different scale. A person who sees Earth from far enough away is forced to confront how contingent and fragile the human arrangement really is. That recognition can sharpen duty rather than dissolve it. You return not because Earth is insignificant, but because it is irreplaceable. The farther away you go, the more singular home becomes. This may be one of the quiet gifts of lunar distance missions. They return not just data, not just capability, but renewed witnesses. Victor Glover, in this sense, is a particularly powerful witness. His testimony, explicit or implicit, carries multiple histories at once. It carries the history of American aviation. It carries the history of black striving in institutions that once excluded or minimized black excellence. It carries the history of NASA's evolution from a product of its era into an agency trying, however imperfectly, to widen the face of exploration. It carries the history of the moon as both destination and mirror, and it carries the future history of every child who will learn his name not as a sociological footnote, but as someone who went far enough from Earth to show what the expanding human story looks like. There is a temptation in stories like this to rush toward triumph, but real triumph becomes stronger when we allow it to remain complicated. Not every barrier falls cleanly. Not every institution reforms as quickly as its public image suggests. Not every historic first solves the underlying problem it symbolizes. One mission does not end exclusion everywhere. One astronaut does not carry the responsibility to redeem an entire national history. We should be careful not to burden individuals with impossible moral jobs. Victor Glover's achievement matters because it is real, not because it single-handedly heals everything around it. Yet real achievements do change the environment. They set precedents, they alter expectations, they remove excuses, they become reference points future decisions can no longer ignore. That is how progress often works in high-performance fields. First, through rare examples, then through revised norms. And what an example this is. A black astronaut associated with the reopening of deep space human flight to lunar distance. A man whose identity matters, but whose readiness is not reducible to identity. A journey that invokes the oldest celestial companion of humanity. A mission architecture meant not only to repeat the past, but to extend it toward a future where the moon becomes a waypoint rather than a museum. Every element reinforces the others. The moon gives the story grandeur. The deep space threshold gives it rarity. Victor Glover gives it human depth. Representation gives it historical force. The mission program gives it future continuity. Together they create something larger than biography or aerospace news. They create a civilizational sentence, one written in fire, training, mathematics, patience, and visible possibility. Let us dwell for a moment on the phrase "see the moon up close," because it contains something almost childlike and something profoundly adult. The childlike part is obvious. For as long as there have been children who asked what it would be like to go there. But the adult part is harder. To see the moon up close is also to understand cost, risk, and the accumulated labor of countless people whose names will never be known to the public. The astronaut's window frames not only a world, but an entire industrial and scientific civilization behind him. Every bolt, every weld, every simulation run, every material analysis, every software verification step, every launch rehearsal, every safety review, every medical examination, every logistical movement, every budget line defended, every instructor hour, every design compromise, every engineering drawing corrected, these become part of the view. The moon is seen through all of that. No human being ever reaches it alone, not even when only a few names appear in the headlines. And perhaps that is one of the most beautiful truths in the story. Victor Glover's journey, however individual it may appear, is also collective in the deepest way. He stands in for many, not in the flattening sense that denies his uniqueness, but in the amplifying sense that reveals how many forms of excellence converge in one mission. The astronaut is the visible tip of a distributed human achievement. This does not diminish the astronaut. It makes the astronaut more meaningful. He becomes the point where a civilization touches its own aspiration. To watch him is to watch thousands of invisible hands become motion. There is also the harsh re-entry reality waiting at the far end of any lunar mission. Going out captures imagination, but coming home may be the most technically punishing phase. Returning from lunar distance involves higher velocities, more extreme thermal loads, and a re-entry environment that demands a different class of protection than typical low Earth orbit returns. The heat shield is not just another system, it is a boundary between survival and destruction. During re-entry, the spacecraft confronts the atmosphere at such energy that surrounding air becomes plasma. Communication can be disrupted, temperatures soar, the capsule must hold, guide, endure. Here again, the elegance of the mission hides brutal physical truth. Deep space travel is merciless about the details, and yet the human story becomes more beautiful, not less, because it survives through details rather than in spite of them. Imagine the emotional arc of such a full mission, the anticipation before launch, the violence of ascent, the strangeness of orbit, the departure, the long black between Earth and Moon, the Moon's growing presence, the far side, the turning, the distant Earth, the beginning of return, the preparation for re-entry, the fire outside, the descent, the splashdown or recovery sequence, the hatch reopening, gravity reasserting itself, fresh air, noise, human faces, then the first steps back into ordinary earthly weight. After having crossed beyond the neighborhood, almost all astronauts know. How does one even begin to speak after that? How do words return to a mouth that has spent days carrying silence from between worlds? Perhaps this is why so many astronauts sound thoughtful, rather than theatrical when they come back. Spectacle belongs to the viewers. The travelers often return quieter. If Victor Glover stands among those travelers, the quietness itself will say something. It will say that history sometimes arrives not through proclamation, but through composure. It will say that a person can carry public meaning without becoming consumed by performance. It will say that one of the most advanced technological societies on Earth finally sent a black astronaut beyond low Earth orbit and closer to the Moon than almost any human in generations, and that the moment, while extraordinary, was handled with the ordinary seriousness required by the profession. There is something profoundly moving about that. The first does not need fireworks in his voice. The fact is enough. What, then, are the results of a journey like this, beyond the obvious mission outcomes? First, there is the result of proof. Proof that the vehicles, procedures, crews, and systems needed for modern crewed deep space missions can operate in the real environment, not just on paper. That proof is invaluable because future missions depend on it. Second, there is the result of continuity. Each successful lunar distance mission makes the next less psychologically impossible. Third, there is the result of perspective. The crew returns with experiences no simulation can fully counterfeit. Fourth, there is the result of memory. A civilization remembers certain faces at turning points, and those faces shape imagination for decades. Fifth, there is the result of correction. The visible story of who belongs in exploration becomes more honest. Sixth, there is the result of invitation. Millions who watch feel the frontier shift from closed to cracked open. And beyond all of that, there is the result of humility. Space exploration at its best does not inflate humanity into conquest mythology. It shrinks our arrogance while enlarging our responsibility. To go to the Moon, or even near it, is not to dominate the cosmos. It is to realize how delicate and improbable life is, How much care is required simply to keep a small crew alive? How dependent even our greatest triumphs are on cooperation, and how foolish many earthbound divisions appear against the black silence beyond our atmosphere. If Victor Glover helps carry that lesson back into public consciousness, then his mission will have achieved something that cannot be fully expressed in technical reports. Yet technical reports matter too, and that duality should never be forgotten. The beauty of spaceflight is that it forces poetry and procedure into the same chamber. You can be moved to the edge of tears by the sight of Earth hanging in darkness, and in the next minute you must verify a subsystem status. You can contemplate the history of exclusion and representation, while also remembering that one incorrectly handled checklist item could compromise the mission. You can feel the moon as myth and as rock. Victor Glover's story sits precisely in that fusion zone, and that is why it is so powerful. It is not a decorative tale floating above the hardware. It is a human reality embedded inside the hardware. There may come a day when the phrase first black astronaut to leave low Earth orbit no longer feels extraordinary because many have followed. That day will be a sign of success, not forgetfulness. The best firsts are not the ones preserved forever in untouchable glass. The best firsts are the ones that open the path so widely that the specialness of the original milestone gradually transforms into a new normal. But during the transitional era, while the path is still narrow, and the first still carries singular visibility, it is worth pausing and understanding the scale of what is happening. This is one of those moments where history, aerospace, and moral imagination briefly align clearly enough that even a distracted age can see it. Maybe that is the deepest reason this story matters. We live in a time of constant noise, constant reaction, constant triviality competing with significance. Yet some events cut through because they reconnect us with long arcs. Victor Glover's journey toward deep space and the moon belongs to a long arc. It reaches back through the history of black aviators, through the civil rights struggle, through the early astronaut era, through the Cold War, through Apollo's departure and long aftermath, through the patient remaking of institutions, through the technical ambition of a new lunar program, and forward into futures not yet built. To follow this story is to step outside the short-term rhythm of headlines and remember that civilization is still being made. So imagine the final image. Not a slogan, not a poster, not a simplified lesson, but a human being inside a spacecraft near the moon, looking at a world humanity has long desired, with Earth somewhere behind or beyond, with the full weight of training and history inside him, with the knowledge that millions on Earth are watching a threshold being crossed. That image contains more than one life. It contains an expansion of who gets to stand at the edge of the human map. It contains the rebirth of deep space crewed flight after long absence. It contains the moon not as fantasy, but as destination regained. It contains the evidence that the frontier, though still difficult and still imperfect, is widening. And when the mission is over, when the data are analysed, when the headlines fade, when the capsule is recovered, when the interviews are done, when the noise of the news cycle moves on, what remains? What remains is a sharpened horizon. What remains is the child who saw possibility. What remains is the engineer who felt renewed purpose. What remains is the teacher who had a new name to place beside equations and aspiration. What remains is the public memory of a black astronaut associated not with the familiar lane of orbital flight alone, but with the older, rarer road toward the moon. What remains is the sense that history did not end with Apollo, and that the human story in space is still being revised by those who are willing to prepare, to serve, to wait, and to go. In the end, that may be the true meaning of Victor Glover's place in this story. Not simply that he is first in a sequence of labels, though firsts do matter. Not simply that he approaches the moon, though proximity to that ancient world is transformative. Not simply that he represents progress, though he does. The deeper meaning is that he stands where multiple unfinished human projects meet. The project of exploration, the project of excellence, the project of justice, the project of public imagination, and the project of becoming a species that can travel outward without carrying all of its old limitations unchanged. That is an immense burden for any one person, and yet maybe that is why the profession chooses so carefully. The frontier does not only require skill, it requires character capable of surviving meaning. So when you hear the title Victor Glover, the first black astronaut to leave low Earth orbit and see the moon up close, hear more than a line of biography. Hear the sound of a boundary thinning. Hear the echo of classrooms, cockpits, control rooms, families, factories, launch pads, and dreams converging. Hear the old moon receiving a new kind of witness. Hear the quiet correction of history at a place where history becomes hard to ignore. Hear the reminder that progress is not automatic. But when it comes, it often arrives embodied in someone who prepared for years simply to be ready when the window opened. And perhaps above all, hear the invitation buried inside the achievement. The invitation to think bigger than the limits inherited by the previous generation. The invitation to treat representation not as decoration but as accuracy. The invitation to respect science deeply enough to understand that facts and meaning do not compete. They reinforce each other. The invitation to see the moon not as the end of a story, but as the nearest chapter in a longer human movement outward. The invitation to believe that the face of exploration can keep widening without sacrificing rigor, courage, or excellence. Because that is the real amazing result of milestones like this. They do not merely add one more name to a list. They alter the imagination of what humanity looks like when it reaches beyond itself. And one day, when lunar missions become more common, when deep space crews are more diverse as a matter of routine rather than novelty, when children speak of traveling beyond Earth with the same naturalness earlier generations reserved for air travel, the memory of this threshold will still matter. It will matter because every era of normality rests on earlier acts of improbability. Every widened path was once narrow. Every ordinary future was once carried by a few people willing to enter an extraordinary present. Victor Glover's story belongs to that category. It belongs to the rare human moments when capability, timing, and history align so precisely that the event becomes both personal and planetary. Yeah, so let the final thought be this. The moon has always looked down on humanity without choosing among us. It shone over empires and slaves, kings and laborers, wars and lullabies, injustice and hope. It witnessed centuries in which many people were told, directly or indirectly, that some heights were not for them. And yet here we are, in an age where a black astronaut can stand at the edge of deep space, carrying the full seriousness of elite training and the quiet thunder of historical change, and prepare to look upon that same moon not from beneath it, but beside it. There is something healing in that, not because it erases the past, but because it refuses to let the past keep dictating the horizon. This is why the story must be told slowly, deeply, and with care, not as a simple victory lap, not as a slogan, not as a piece of temporary inspiration that evaporates by tomorrow, but as a living chapter in the long human attempt to become worthy of the worlds we can now reach. Victor Glover's journey toward the moon, and the meaning attached to it, reminds us that the greatest missions do more than move bodies through space. They move the boundaries of memory, belonging, and possibility. They teach us that a frontier is never complete until more of humanity can see itself there. They show us that when the spacecraft leaves low Earth orbit, something else leaves too. An old assumption about who the edge belongs to. And that is why this matters. Because the edge belongs to whoever can meet it with discipline, courage, humility, and excellence. Because the moon, once unreachable, now waits within the hard-earned reach of a civilization still learning how to represent itself honestly. Because Victor Glover embodies the truth that talent delayed is not talent absent. Because history can be late and still be real when it arrives. Because a child somewhere will look up tonight and see the moon differently after knowing who went near it. Because Earth, seen from deep space, reveals how foolish our narrowness has always been. Because the mission is not only outward, it is inward too. It changes how we see the sky, but also how we see ourselves. And if we go even deeper, beyond the historic language, beyond the institutional meaning, beyond the engineering, we arrive at something more intimate and more unsettling. The fact that every great leap outward forces a person to confront the scale of their own smallness without losing the strength to act. That is one of the hidden tests of spaceflight. It is not enough to be technically excellent. You must also remain psychologically intact while moving through an environment that constantly reminds you how tiny and vulnerable a human life really is. On Earth, we are protected by familiarity. Gravity holds us, air surrounds us, sound travels the way we expect, distance behaves according to habit, and the horizon lies to us gently by making the world feel manageable. In space, those deceptions begin to collapse. A spacecraft cabin is not a home in the usual sense. It is an agreement between fragility and intelligence. It is a pocket of biology protected by metallurgy, software, seals, valves, and discipline. And every astronaut knows that the pocket is thin. Perhaps that is why the astronaut's mindset has always fascinated people. We imagine fear disappearing in the presence of training, but that is not really how it works. Training does not erase fear. Training gives fear a container. It teaches the body and mind how to move when the emotional system is sending warnings. Victor Glover's likely strength in such a role is not that he would be untouched by the magnitude of the mission, but that he would know how to keep magnitude from becoming interference. That distinction matters. Anyone can be impressed by the moon. The harder task is to remain useful while being impressed by it. Anyone can understand the historic nature of a first. The harder task is to keep that understanding from bending your concentration at the wrong moment. Anyone can talk about courage on Earth. The harder task is to practice it, where the consequences are measured not in embarrassment or failure, but in survival. And then there is the silence. Space is often described visually, but silence may be its more profound signature. Not silence in the sense of total sensory emptiness, because spacecraft are full of fans, pumps, electronics, communications, ventilation, and the low mechanical language of life-supporting systems. But silence in the sense that the universe outside does not carry sound to you. Explosions can happen in vacuum without thunder. Vast distances can exist without whisper. Celestial bodies can move in enormous, deadly, beautiful choreography without making the kind of noise our Earth-trained nervous systems expect from motion. There is something psychologically disorienting about that. It means the human being in the spacecraft becomes even more dependent on instruments, on procedure, on training, and on trust in systems that translate invisible dangers into readable signals. In deep space, reality must often be interpreted before it can be felt. That is a profound inversion of ordinary life. What would it mean for Victor Glover to carry all of this while also carrying the awareness that his presence itself is historically charged? It means the mission would be taking place on two levels simultaneously. On the first level, there is the literal mission: launch, trajectory, systems management, crew coordination, observation, return. On the second level, there is the invisible mission: absorbing the meaning of the moment without letting that meaning compromise the first level. This dual burden is rare. Most professionals, even in difficult fields, are allowed to perform without being asked to symbolize. Most symbols, on the other hand, are not required to operate complex machines in lethal environments while representing progress to millions. To be both operationally critical and culturally resonant at the same time is a very unusual human condition. That is part of what makes the story worthy of sustained attention. And let us not forget that deep space flight is also a form of time travel in the emotional sense. When humans approach the moon, they do not only move through physical space, they move into conversation with the past. Every lunar mission echoes Apollo whether it wants to or not. The moon remembers in the human imagination the boot prints, the flags, the television broadcasts, the static-laced voices, the images that changed history. Any modern astronaut heading toward that realm travels alongside ghosts of earlier missions, not in superstition, but in cultural memory. Victor Glover, associated with that road, would not merely be going somewhere new. He would be entering one of the most mythologized human arenas ever created. Yet unlike the Apollo era, this new chapter carries a different face, a different national conversation, a different sense of who belongs in the archive of human expansion. So even the comparison with the past becomes part of the mission. The moon is the same, but the witnesses are changing. There is a powerful lesson in that. Places do not remain fixed in meaning. The same mountain, ocean, desert, or moon can mean different things to different eras, depending on who arrives and who is seen arriving. During one historical period, a frontier may represent conquest, rivalry, exclusivity, and prestige. In another, it may begin to represent inclusion, sustainability, shared human effort, and the correction of old exclusions. The moon itself does not change emotionally. We change emotionally around it. That is why Victor Glover's place in the lunar story is so significant. He helps alter the emotional ownership of the destination, not ownership in the legal or territorial sense, but in the symbolic sense. He expands the number of people who can see themselves reflected in the act of going. This matters even more because the moon is not just a destination of nostalgia. it is increasingly viewed as a proving ground for the future. Life support systems, power systems, navigation methods, operational rhythms, crew psychology, habitat concepts, communication strategies, and mission architectures developed around lunar exploration will shape whatever comes next. In that sense, the first modern crews going back outward are not merely reenacting history, they are drafting procedures for futures that do not yet exist. Their choices, performance, and public memory will ripple into planning for Mars and beyond. So when Victor Glover is connected to the Moon, he's not only linked to a retrospective symbolic achievement, he is also linked to the forward edge of interplanetary preparation. He stands at a bridge point between remembrance and rehearsal,